Welcome to our session on can measuring what matters plus equitable evaluation lead to diverse, equitable, and inclusive learning. I'm Sarah Mohammed, and with me is Olka. Shiamara Padansi was supposed to present with us from Promise 54, but she was unexpectedly unable to make it today. She's very disappointed that she can't be here with y'all and sends her regrets. So we will keep letting folks in as they join. And I did want to name, there sometimes is a bit of a lag in advancing the slides. So if we pause for a bit, or if we end up having to go back a slide or two, please bear with us as we sort of make the technology work. So I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about myself. There we go. There have always been sort of two parallel interests that I've had that early on in my career have felt very much parallel, like not convergent, but more recently have started to really align with each other and become quite convergent in the work that I do. So one of those is I've always had an interest and sort of an ability and motivation in math, as well as in understanding people and sort of cognition. And underlying that, I've always been sort of interested and compelled by relationships, especially relationships that have to do with cause and effect. So things like behavior and consequence, you know, anything that has to do, and in math with, you know, things on one side of the equal sign and things on the other side of the equal sign. And so that led me on the math side to really want to understand quantitative statistical methods. And on the psychological side, it really led me to want to understand sort of these more implicit, less tangible behaviors and consequences, which are very, very, you know, they occur a lot in learning. And so my interest in cognition turned much more specifically to learning and how people learn. My interest in math turned more specifically into quantitative methods. And so that led me on the math side to become somewhat of a research mobilizer, someone who was interested in like how these numerical and quantitative relationships play out in real life. And on the cognition side also led me to really be interested in how is bias sort of interwoven into these behavior and consequence relationships, and how does that influence people's experiences. And so that led me overall to thinking about a research framework that I refer to now as just research, which is really combining the math and the cognitive interests and understandings in order to better understand how numbers and statistical designs can influence people's lives in biased or unbiased ways. So if I can get the slide to move, we will go to the next slide, which is really an activity. So I can start talking about it. I'm actually going to give you all a math pop quiz. It's very simple and there are no tricks here. So it really is as simple as it seems. I would like you to imagine that there is a school and this school has 3 classes. One class has 1 student, one class has 3 students, and the third class has 5 students. So in all, there are 9 students. 1 is in a class by themselves, 3 are together in a second class, and then the last 5 are in a class together. And the question that I'm going to ask you to do mentally is, what is the average class size in this school? But before I ask you that, how many people think that there is one answer to this question? You can raise your hand if your video is on. You can drop it in the chat. Is there one answer to this question? I'm good at practicing my wait time. I see one hand. Thank you, Kate. Maybe one more. Okay. So now take a few seconds, maybe a minute, and answer the question. What is the average class size in this school? Kate says 3. Michelle says, maybe there are 2 answers to this question. All right, it's a pretty simple calculation to do. The delay on these slides is a little bit frustrating. But I think most of you would have gotten 3. So the average class size is 3. And that is the correct answer if I had collected my data from teachers or administrators or you know, an external observer. If I had gone in and someone had said, there's one class with 1, one class with 3, one class with 5. So the average class size is 5 plus 3 plus 1, which I said before is 9. And then you divide by 3 classes, you get 3. But Michelle had a bit of an insight into where I was going with this. There actually is another correct answer to this question, which is, if I had asked the students, if I had collected my data from students and said, how many, what is your class size? How many students are in your class? 1 student would have said 1, 3 students would have said 3, and 5 students would have said 5. And so when you add those up and divide those by 9 students, you actually would end up with an answer that's closer to 4. I think it's 3.89. And so the point of this activity is to sort of illustrate in a very concrete way that many of us have been trained to think about numerical data, quantitative data, as being inherently unbiased, as having one solution, one answer, one right answer. And by quantifying, we are often trained to think that we are eliminating bias because numbers are uninfluenced by perspective. And that's actually not the case. Numbers are just as influenced by perspective as more qualitative forms of data are. And in fact, the lived experience of one of those students in that school is probably different from the experience that a teacher has, even in that same distribution of classes or of class sizes. And so the fact that the numerical answer is different if you ask a student than if you ask a teacher also reflects a difference in the truth and the experience of those individuals in those classrooms. So I'm going to start by, I'm going to tell the story of like where bias could possibly hide in quantitative measurement through a series of illustrations of studies. And so the first one is the marshmallow study, which some of you may have heard of before. It was actually a pretty mainstream popular study when it was done. It started back in the 90s and it followed a group of 4-year-olds through a test called the marshmallow test, which I will describe, and then later on into their academic careers. So these 4-year-olds were brought into a room and they were told by a person wearing a lab coat that they could have a marshmallow, and there was really a marshmallow there. They could have a marshmallow right now, or they could wait until the person in the lab coat went to get another marshmallow. And if they could wait until that person came back and the first marshmallow was still there, they would be able to get the second marshmallow as well. So if they ate their marshmallow right now, they had 1 marshmallow, that was it. But if they could wait until the person went to the lab, got a second marshmallow and came back, then they would get 2 marshmallows, which I don't know about you, but even for me, it's been a long time since I've been 4. But that seems like a reasonable, like doubling your number of marshmallows just while someone goes to the next room and comes back seems like a pretty good return on investment. And so what they found was that there was a wide variety. There were some kiddos who ate their marshmallow before the person in the lab coat even finished explaining what was going to happen. And there were others who even waited when the person came back and gave them the second marshmallow and said, if I wait longer, can I get a third marshmallow? And so in the end, all of the kids got all of the marshmallows. There were no marshmallows withheld in the conduction of this study. But what they were able to do was correlate that ability to wait with a lot of later outcomes. So early reading achievement, early math achievement, and other life outcomes like school persistence, retention, and things like that. And so what they found and what they interpreted from this study was that self-control is highly correlated with life success. And so if you could develop interventions and have students practice their self-control from young ages, what you would be doing is setting them up on a trajectory that increase their chances of leading a successful life in academic and non-academic outcomes. And so this was a pretty well-known finding. It was cited often. There were many interventions that actually did focus on self-control, especially in pre-K and kindergarten classrooms. And there was, as part of what was called the replication crisis in psychological studies, it started in the mid 2010s, and it's still sort of an issue now. Someone decided that they were going to try to replicate the study. And so what they published in 2018 was that actually, if you measured and included a child's household income and other measures of socioeconomic status, for example, their parents' years of education, the type of work that their parents did, whether there was a 1 or 2 income household, the effects of self-control completely disappeared. So instead of measuring self-control with this, pretty clever marshmallow test, what was actually being measured was a child's level of income. When you think of it that way, it sort of makes sense. If someone, especially a young person, is living in a resource-scarce environment, there is actually no incentive to wait when you have a resource right in front of you, right? And so you learn very early on that a bird in the hand is worth many in the bush. So if you give me a marshmallow and tell me I can eat that marshmallow, it almost doesn't matter what you say after that, because in my world and in my experience, I should eat that marshmallow because I don't know when I'm going to get the next one. But if I live in a resource-rich environment, I'm actually pretty well primed to, one, trust people that say, if you wait, I'm going to come back and I'm going to bring another marshmallow, but also to be able to weigh the costs and benefits of, well, it is a risk, but it's a risk that I'm willing to take because I live in an environment that sort of reinforces the notion that resources are available. And this is not the only marshmallow I'm going to see today. And so I might as well take the chance because the reward is worth the risk. All of which to say, sometimes when we think we're measuring what matters, but we're not actually considering all other possible experiential and just perspectives of the participants in our study or the members of the community or the environments that we are studying, we can miss, pretty important relationships. And so we think we're measuring what matters, but actually we may not be measuring what we think we are. So the last story I'm going to tell is more of an evaluation story. And this is also a real evaluation that took place in a large urban school district. And basically, this district wanted to understand if one-to-one reading tutoring was effective at closing achievement gaps in middle school. And so they chose all of their 6th graders who were struggling in reading. And by that, they meant 6th graders who were reading at or below a 3rd grade level. So they were far behind in reading. And what they did was they provided a trained reading tutor for each of those students. And that tutor provided 1 hour of one-on-one reading intervention per week for the entire school year. And the evaluator used a pre-post reading assessment in both the treatment and the comparison group. And so that the comparison group were the remainder of the 6th graders who weren't in the intervention. And this is what they found. Essentially, they found that the students who were receiving reading intervention grew 1 year's worth of reading in 1 year. Basically the same as you would expect a typically progressing 6th grader to grow. And of course, the intervention was much more resource intensive than the business as usual model. So there needed to be a cadre of trained reading interventionists who were spending 1 hour a week with each 6th grader that was so far behind. So these were the results that were presented in the evaluation report. Now, these results and this evaluation study were measuring the right things, right? They were measuring reading. They were measuring reading at pre and at post. It was an evidence-based intervention that they were investigating. So one-on-one reading tutoring is well studied, and trainings for one-on-one reading tutoring are also evidence-based. And so this was not a matter of maybe measuring the wrong thing. It was not a matter of, there being more than one answer necessarily. But what was not done in this study was the recipients of the reading intervention and their teachers were never asked if they found the intervention to be successful. So basically, the evaluator reported that there were no effects. And in fact, the district discontinued the intervention. But if you had stepped back even 1 year prior, what you would have seen is that the rate of reading growth for the treatment group actually doubled in 1 year. So in the past, if you were reading at a 3rd grade level at the beginning of 6th grade, it means that at most you were experiencing half of a typical year's growth in reading in 1 year in all of your prior school years. And you got this intervention, and all of a sudden you were reading at a typical rate of growth. And so it is probably the case that if teachers and learners were asked, did this intervention work? Their description, first of all, their expectations for what success means, their sort of definition of success was probably more around the experience of reading, right? Are students experiencing more success in reading with this intervention than they were before? And if you ask the question that way, even without looking at the prior year's data, but by asking students, how are they experiencing success? Are they feeling more successful in reading? You likely would have come to a different conclusion, right? Because doubling someone's rate of reading growth, especially a struggling reader, is no small task. And to experience that kind of growth as a struggling reader, it feels very different. Your identity and your self-efficacy and the way that you see yourself in relation to text can change drastically with such an increase in your ability to progress in reading. So overall, I think what this all of the underlying takeaways in these examples, but also in the work that I do, it really has to do with how are you sort of viewing research and measurement and the folks who have the power to design those things. And so if you do have time, like we don't have time right now, but I did want to share these slides with you as potential things that you can do on your own or in your school teams. But if you do think about where are the places where we might think sincerely that we are measuring what matters, but instead what we're doing is actually perpetuating inequitable systems. We are perpetuating bias, and we are using numbers in ways that do lead to greater inequities, or at least persistent inequities. These are some of the questions. This is from a group called the Equitable Evaluation Institute, but these are some of the questions that you can ask yourself about when we think about measurement and measuring what matters. Where are the places that biases can hide and persist, right? So the questions are, how can we ensure that the voice of those most impacted is not really seen as separate from and different from valid evidence? And there are 4 on here. I'm not going to read them all for you. The next activity is an even more sort of hands-on one. So this is from a group called We All Count. And what they have created is a data bias framework as well as a data bias assessment tool. And so you can go to this link. You can choose a data set that you already have or one that has not yet been collected. And you go through a series of questions, and in the end, it gives you a result scorecard, but it also gives you, it also gives you your actual results and your responses to each of the questions in 7 or 8 broad areas. And it just gives you a overview of like there probably is not much data hiding in this example in questions 1 and 2, but you might want to start to consider where bias might be hiding in your data in questions 3 and 4. And then for this particular example, 5 through 8 seem okay, but you might also get red dots for some of the questions. And so if you are implementing on a regular basis a data collection method like a survey, I know that's really common, or if you are considering adopting a new data collection method, this is something that it would be helpful to think about, and this works for qualitative and quantitative data, to really ensure that you are considering the perspectives of the communities that you are trying to serve, the folks who will be participating and answering, giving you their data, but it also helps you to think about bias in a different way. And it helps you consider the entire spectrum of places where bias can enter the data and data collection process. So it's not just in collection, right? But it's in from the get-go, from when you're choosing a data source and a data collection method, all the way to how you communicate your findings. So I also wanted to share that tool with you. And I believe that is my last slide. So I'm going to turn it over to Ilka.
Great. Thanks, Saro. Can everyone hear me? I just want to make sure everything, okay, great. Hi, my name is Ilka Joshi Hansen, and it's great to be here with you guys today. It's funny, I'm going to start, Saro went in and zoomed in, and what I'm hoping to do is pull back a little bit and give a slightly wider and broader and more historical context for some of the conversations that I think need to be happening in assessment and measurement and our perceptions of what education and what good education looks like if we're really going to go towards a more equitable system. Now, I am also having trouble advancing slides. All right. Here we go. So it's funny because I want to name the fact that I think over the last 3 years, I've been going in real time through the journey that I think we're talking about many of our students going through right now, which is, what is it to live in a dominant culture that is different from the culture in which you grow up or your family is kind of grounded? And I am a philosopher by training, but I'm also a researcher and a lawyer. And so in this presentation, I'm going to give you a little bit more of the kind of philosophical analysis of the question that we're asking today, right? What matters? How do we know what matters? And what does it mean for us to assess and to gather evidence, data, information so that we can make judgments about what we know? And for me, there was this tension growing up between the kind of American culture that my Indian East African family was raising me to live inside of and to succeed inside of, and the world that I lived in at home, which was a much more kind of collectivist, integrated, one could say sort of an ecological view of the world and our relationship with other people and the broader communities that we existed inside of. So when I went to college, to a very small liberal arts school, and went into the philosophy department, not shockingly, most of the study that I did was of kind of white male philosophers and a tradition that kind of was grounded in Europe starting in kind of the 12, 13, 1400s. And I actually kind of branched out and spent about half my time looking at Eastern philosophical systems. So asking the same questions, right? What's the nature of reality, and what is knowledge, and what does it mean to know something? And it was very interesting to see how differently those things were answered when I was looking at two different philosophical traditions. So for my graduate work, and I see that there's a chat going on. Katie, you had your hand raised during Saro's presentation. Do you want to unmute and ask a question, or do you want to hold it? Because if there's something you want to clarify, I don't want you to have to sit with it. All right, I'm gonna just feel free to stick something inside the chat if you need to. So for my graduate work, I really went, I went ahead and went backwards into Europe to try and understand some of the foundations, the philosophical foundations, the things that influenced the development of the education system that we knew and what was happening historically. So the story I'm going to tell you, like super quick overview, is how these divergent worldviews kind of birthed themselves in modern Europe around the 1500s. Because before the 1500s, the worldview that kind of dominated kind of societies and shaped the culture and the context all over the world and indigenous communities, including in Europe, was a much more holistic, medieval, sort of mystical worldview, where the medieval era was a time where people had a sense that there was more than what they knew. They didn't necessarily have the scientific kind of tools to be able to analyze and to make sense of it. And so the world was this interesting kind of combination of stories, of myths, of legends, and also knowledge that had been passed down from generation to generation. The scientific revolution was birthed around the 1500s. And I'm going to list off a bunch of names, and modern European history in high school was one of my least favorite subjects because I could never remember names and dates and particular accomplishments. But some of these men really birthed the scientific revolution and birthed a view of the world that we can think of as a Cartesian Newtonian worldview. So Galileo Galilei, right? He believed that properties that should be measured were things that were quantifiable or that you could see: shapes, numbers, movements. Things like color and sound or taste or smell were subjective. And he felt that those had no place in any type of scientific inquiry. Francis Bacon was somebody who really kind of perpetuated the idea that nature was a resource that should be used for the betterment of humankind and society. Rene Descartes was, I think, therefore I am. You've probably heard that, but he really began to sort of perpetuate this idea that knowledge and thinking were equatable. So you know things because you think them. You don't know them because you live them or you experience them or you feel them in your body. Isaac Newton really believed that the world was a machine and that we could figure out the laws of the world. And people like Darwin were trying to understand those laws in areas like biology. What ends up happening is you have divergent worldviews. I'm trying to advance the slide. In science. So you have these divergent worldviews in science, and I've just pulled out a few kind of 4 key areas, right? But the view of reality was that human beings and the natural world and our wider context are somehow separate. The rational mind alone was taken to be the way in which we could understand the world. So the world was out there, and our rational minds could understand the world in an objective manner. There was a notion that knowledge is a building that has solid foundations and fundamental building blocks, and that it's possible for us to identify those building blocks which are discrete and eternal and stay the same. And if we could understand all of them, we could have a complete knowledge of the world. And the 4th big belief was that complex systems are the sum of their parts. Now, this Cartesian Newtonian view in science was very different from both what came before and a kind of competing worldview that we can call the holistic or ecological worldview in science that began to emerge around the 1700s with people like Albert Einstein, a guy named Johann Smuts, who worked in evolutionary biology. And without going into the specifics of what it was, they were sort of finding the scientific grounding for a lot of the beliefs of communities and societies pre-scientific revolution, right? This idea that human beings and nature are mutually dependent and that how we are has an impact on a system that is greater than ourselves. There was a shift in epistemology. There is no such thing as objective science and knowledge. So to Saro's point, who we are, where we sit, our perspective is always going to influence how we see the world and how we interpret it. So we need to leave aside the notion that anything is truly objective, understand that most things are subjective, and then navigate our sort of understanding of the world in light of that. There was an idea of knowledge being a network of information, and it begins from a space of relationship and interconnectivity. So the idea that you can take one piece of a system, pull it out, and understand it is not realistic because that one piece sits inside of a larger system and it's all interconnected. So a system is more than just the sum of its parts. And so these divergent worldviews in science, to Saro's point, have deeply influenced our understanding of what it is to assess, what it is to evaluate, what it is to measure. And to just kind of give the broadest context, right? And I think we're sitting in a moment in America and I think globally where we're understanding that this Cartesian Newtonian worldview, which, to put it really crudely, was exported out of Europe in the 15, 16, 1700s and imposed in many other parts of the world through colonialism, right? And that those divergent worldviews birth very different ways of constructing societies and systems. So I've just listed here, right? When you look at different disciplines and read across different disciplines, you've often got these debates going on about, is one thing the right way or is another thing the right way? So economics is a really good example. Classical economics has this idea of like a rational man and perfect information. And behavioral economists now are saying, well, that's ridiculous because economic systems don't work as these finely honed systems that will be perfect if we can have perfect knowledge and rational beings. Euclidean geometry of perfect shapes, right? The geometry that most of us learned in school was designed to measure man-made things. Fractal geometry and fractal math is actually the type of math that we use to understand nature, because nature is living, it's emergent, it's jagged, it's uneven. And we'll come back to that in a second. But I just want to name a couple of things, right? The same mindset that birthed colonialism and enslavement, the same mindset that kind of birthed this idea of hyper-individualism, paternalistic systems, patriarchy, right? That same mindset birthed what we think of as the factory model of education and many of the methods that we currently use for trying to understand both how that system is designed and also how it is that we measure and know how well that system is operating. So really briefly, I was interested to see whether we could, in the modern context, understand how these different worldviews play out in educational systems. And I did a 2.5-year research project that took me around the country to lots of different types of schools, all types of different governance models, pre-K through 12. And after kind of collecting all the data, which included observations, interviews with students, with educators, with parents, community members, teachers, et cetera, what you get is this kind of, it's obviously a continuum, but generally speaking, kind of 3 general orientations to the work of education. The far left-hand side is what you could think of as conventional. So it's the industrial model, right? The factory model that I won't go over, but there's some interesting things inside of it, right? They start up here with the academic piece. They're very driven by college prep, but they also live out a lot of these assumptions about knowledge. So they're very driven by summative, standardized testing. They are very teacher directed in their view of how learning happens. So it's about teacher moves, teacher delivery. There is a sense that learning is linear and sequential. So you kind of go through content in a way that's predetermined. And they're doing social, emotional, and character work, but it tends to be kind of imbued in this sense of, these are the values of our school, you must accept these values. If you don't, you're not being a good student, right? They're doing social and emotional work in a much more functional way. Like, we want to do SEL curriculum because it helps students do better academically. This middle bucket of schools are really wide, and what holds them together is that they recognize the shortcomings of this approach, and they bolt on solutions. So they bolt on socio-emotional curriculum, or they bolt on culturally responsive practice, or they bolt on DEI work, or they bolt on project-based learning, but they've never actually gone back down to the fundamental assumption about what they're doing, why they're doing it, who children are, how they grow, how they learn, to really redesign themselves. And so in many ways, both of these kind of orientations to education are still operating in that left-hand side column in terms of worldview. They're trying to mitigate the impacts, but they're not actually rethinking how they're designed. This right-hand side column of schools, if I named them, you would know them. They would be places like the Portfolio School or One Stone, a lot of pure Montessori programs. They are what I call human-centered and liberatory approaches, and they are grounded very deeply in that right-hand side worldview in terms of how they think about the purpose of education. They really consider and fold in what we know about human development, which is jagged, and this process of unfolding. They believe that learning is very much about individual children making sense and meaning out of their work, out of what they're learning, and that it is also jagged, not uniform, not linear and sequential. In the same way, I don't want to dig into this too much, but if there are questions, I'm happy to dig deeper. But my basic argument is that to the extent that we are reconceptualizing our our definitions and our understanding of what educational equity actually is. And to the extent that we are really trying to take seriously the idea that there are foundational values in our existing system that we need to rethink, these right-hand side column schools are really where we should be going. And if for no other reason, right, there are systems and social level reasons why I think that's important. But educational equity, to me, has to take the human dimension of who young people are and what they need in terms of their self-identity, their sense of purpose, having relationships, connections to community, social capital, right? And it also needs to take into account the academic dimension, which includes the idea that people are different, they learn differently, they show their learning differently. And we need to have ways of honoring that and measuring it, which means that we can't take approaches to measurement that are about standardizing, about trying to reduce everything to numbers and make them the same so that we can compare them falsely, right? Feel like we're comparing two things that may not actually be the same. And so, again, I'm happy to come back to these slides, but there are some real shifts in system elements, and among them are accountability metrics, how we think about accountability that these transformed systems need. And that happens both at the level of the individual child, it happens at the level of the school, and it happens at the level of the system. But just to kind of name, right, that in terms of assessment of student outcomes, there's a real need to focus on development, that the pace and sequence of outcomes of learning and learning itself are unique and jagged for different students. Standardized testing as a format isn't going to be the best way for all learners to demonstrate what they know. So we need authentic assessments that really align to different learning experiences and how children can show what they know best. And when we think about school level accountability, we need to be broadening our sense of how we think about the outcomes, allowing them to be more mission specific and responsive to the needs of the community. And it's going to be really difficult to have straight comparability across schools. And Sarah and I have had this conversation a lot, but to me, what that means is that we need to introduce an understanding of things like fractal math and the measurement of natural systems, because human beings and the human systems that we have our children inside of are nothing if not kind of living, organic, like alive systems that are much more like the natural world and ecology than they are like static, kind of perfect human design systems. And so we've got to shift our whole understanding of measurement to learn from different fields like ecology, like biology, where people are already using these types of mathematical approaches. So I think that's my last slide. And I will pass it back to Saro for questions and discussions. We've got about 20 minutes, I think. So thank you.
Yep, we're open for questions. I think I will add, I hope that what you got from the two presentations together is not just sort of a dumping on where we are and what that means for numerous, like quantifying things, but also the fact that we can very much still live in an evidence-based world, and we can learn about the world that we live in. We can learn and measure what matters, but it does require a shift in thinking. It requires, like as Ulrika proposed, that shift from a more Cartesian Newtonian worldview to a more ecological worldview. But it also, because we are interested in measuring people and behaviors, I think it also must be much more community engaged and community based, where we stop thinking of researchers and measurers as the experts who are sort of external to a system. And I suspect that in that ecological worldview is also the idea that the best measurement comes from within. And so to really understand and be able to measure a growing, breathing, jagged, uneven system, you must actually yourself become a part of it. And that means understanding your own perspectives and biases and the sort of slant that you bring to that system, but also you can't really understand the interactions that are happening in the system without yourself being a part of it, which is, I think, just sort of a radically, I know for me, it's a radically different way of thinking about measurement compared to the ways that we have been taught and trained to think about it. So we have a question from Anne. How can we shift models of conventional thinking to a more holistic model in a large governmentally regulated school system? And so I think because Ulka has spent so much time in schools that are existing in this system with the rest of us, I'm gonna let her take the first stab.
Okay, so Anne, I just want to, how can we shift models of conventional to a more holistic model? Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think it requires us, part of what I think is really important about this like really brief overview I gave you is that we need to understand the nature of the change that we are trying to affect, right? And we need to understand that the DNA of the existing system is coded with these old values, and that we're not going to be able to simply pull out one part of the system and try and put something else in, because the system in a sense is going to cannibalize the whole thing, right? And kind of pull it back into the existing paradigm or the existing way of thinking. Sorry, and someone's asking me to put up the slide of the 3 systems. Do you want the slide? I don't know if I can, are the slides still up? If Natalie, if you could do it, that'd be great. Do you want the table, or do you want the kind of image or diagram? And
image.
Okay. So for me, at least, if I had to articulate a theory of change, right, it's that we need to give space and permission and time for the people who are already operating inside of this this mindset and this orientation to the work. We need to give them kind of research and development space to start answering the questions about what a fully aligned system looks like, right? Because we have to rethink everything from how do you credential learning if it's not happening inside the walls of a school, to what does it mean to assess differently? What does it mean to kind of hold schools accountable? What does it mean to prepare adults to do this kind of work, right? What does it mean to look at funding differently if all of a sudden you're looking at a holistic thing and school's not happening inside the walls of this building, right? So you've got to have these aligned and mutually reinforcing and supportive systems. So to me, as much as I hate using a military analogy, this is one of the moments where I think the military actually has a model that we need to learn from, right? This, as a tool would not exist if DARPA and the military about 40 years ago hadn't created space inside of the military for some of the most forward-thinking minds to have space and room and freedom from the existing constraints of the system to radically rethink and reimagine the way that they did work. So to me, like a way to do this would be, I live in Denver, would be for a place like Colorado to say, all right, we want to take the coalition of the willing. We want to take schools that are doing this work, communities that want to do this work, as well as system players, right? Everybody from unions to businesses to civic and community advocacy groups to higher ed to state policymakers and funding budget analysts. We're going to bring them together. And we're going to really lay out a time to take folks who are sitting in this third bucket, right, and want to do this work, to actually have 5 to 7 years, because I think that's what it's going to take, right, to actually build and sort of invent the new ways of doing things that are going to allow these systems to actually thrive and exist inside the public system. Because right now, the vast majority of these schools exist in the independent and private sector, and interestingly enough, in our alternative high school sector. Right? But if we want them in the public system, you've got to give people space and time. I think we lay out accountability metrics. We say we are accountable to both process outcomes and new ways of doing things. And we allow that group of people to very slowly start to answer the questions that we know exist. So it's a, the change adoption curve that some of you may be familiar with in terms of technology. You've always got the people that are going to be building something that the next stage or wave of adopters is going to look at and adopt. And so we need to give people time inside the public system to kind of build the new system structures and policies that, as the existing system buckles under its own weight, because I really think, given the world, given technology, given artificial intelligence, given the kind of social and racial justice demands that I don't think are going away, the current system is going to buckle under its own weight. And I think you need to give kind of new alternatives and options for people to then be able to spread and look at, to influence and inspire what they do in their own context. I hope that helps.
Olka, can I present a question to you?
Mm-hmm.
So I love the presentation. Thank you, Sarah and Olka. Really fired me up. But When you were looking at the dichotomy of streams of knowledge, right? I kind of arrived at that, I guess, hypothesis or conclusion from an anthropological perspective. And I noticed that you also included the perspective of indigenous populations, right? So I've done some work with indigenous populations. Now, within the US education landscape, is there space for alternative ways of knowing so that, when we pursue decision making, for example, prioritizations and even the infrastructure, do you think that we can come to a space where we are allowed to propose or even include alternative ways of knowing in the decision making process?
Sarah, you want to take that?
So yes, I'm actually working on a somewhat secret but pretty exciting project right now, where I have literally all 10 fingers and toes crossed right here that my answer soon to you will be yes. Because right now the answer is no. And very implicitly, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Bennett's dimensions of intercultural sensitivity. So he goes from talking about being in an ethnocentric space to being in an ethno-relative frame of thinking, in terms of focusing more on bringing your own culture and your own experience to the fore in interactions with other cultures and experiences, and then moving along a pathway to being able to actually understand your own culture and experiences in relation to others. And so I argue that we're actually, as sort of research and development in education in the US in 2020, we are in the marginalization stage, which is still very ethnocentric. But we sincerely believe, and we think and we talk as if we're in the acceptance stage, which is the first stage of the ethno-relativity, right? So we talk about research practitioner partnerships, and we talk about understanding context, and we talk about like measuring fidelity of implementation, and all of these are ways to sort of acknowledge like our methods and processes are somewhat incomplete, and there are questions that we are unable to answer. And so we're trying to add on all of these different lenses and mechanisms for making it more complete, when really we are in the classical physics of education research, but we think we're at the beginning of quantum physics, and there's still a whole lot that we don't see and we don't know and we think doesn't exist. And so I'm making the case on your behalf, Rolando, and all of our other underserved students, that actually we need to harness the will and the resources, the means and the intentions in order to make that reality a reality. So I'm glad you asked. There is a question from Rebecca that I will look for the Bennett reference. I might not be able to drop it in the chat right this minute, but I will definitely have, if there are follow-up materials that are sent out, I will definitely include it there. But so Rebecca's question is sort of my favorite question, and it's the one I get asked bar none the most. What about rigor? How do we know if something really works, right? Like all of this fuzzy, hand wavy, touchy feely, like ask the students and ask the teachers, like that doesn't tell us if something really works. And my response to that is manyfold. The first thing I say is we actually don't know if something works in our current research processes, right? You can design the perfect experimental study and you can replicate it and you can do a meta-analysis, and you still do not know that whatever you studied will work for all kids at all times in all contexts. So we try to tell ourselves that our current processes are a little bit more competent than they are in terms of rigor. Another thing that I point out though is that there are biases and they do get propagated. So you can point to discipline data that show, right, that African-American students are adultified and they're disciplined in ways that are much more harsh as young as 3 years old. So that's a data point that illustrates it. There's a neat little trick. I used to say like, I'm sure this is true. And then I actually went and did the bar chart. But can anyone guess whether or not the evidence base that supports the What Works Clearinghouse right now So the Wentworth Clearinghouse, as many of you may know, is a compilation of studies that have met standards for experimental, quasi-experimental, and single case designs. I think those are the only ones that they have standards for in terms of their contribution to the evidence base. And so they have a list of studies that they've reviewed and interventions that they've reviewed that have met these standards, either with or without reservations, to tell us the extent to which these work. So how many of you can guess whether or not the student ethnic breakdown of the evidence base that supports the current Wentworth Clearinghouse, do you think it represents our national enrollment? It does not. It overrepresents white students by 6%, which is a small percentage compared to the prevalence of white students in the population. It underrepresents Black students by that same 6%, which is 1/3 of the population of Black students that are currently enrolled K-12 in public schools. So not only is there over and underrepresentation, the representation itself disproportionately affects our marginalized students, right? Well, so that's another thing that I say. And so I just basically, I respond to that by saying it's actually more rigorous to understand, to acknowledge where your biases are, to understand how to surface them and keep them front and center as you do these studies. And I'm not opposed to quantitative data, but I am opposed to hiding behind randomization or quantification as a sort of a means of saying, well, look, we did it this way, so we've eliminated all bias. This is perfectly objective. And so we know, right? It is actually more rigorous to shine a light on your own bias, to shine a light on places where bias enters your studies, and to be very transparent about what that bias is and where it is, if you cannot take steps to remove it.
Well, and I think I'll just add to that, right? I think it's why it's so important to understand the nature of the conversation we're actually having. Because if we're having the conversation on the terms of somehow we can understand, because even the whole format of randomized controlled trials and the gold standard is that you are trying to remove something from the context of the whole and say whether it works, but you know, and you don't care about apparently the other kind of impacts that that one intervention has on the system as a whole. So if we believe that a school or a classroom is actually a community that is a dynamic system, right, then there's something really wrong with saying that we're going to try and capture this discrete piece of it. So I think for me, at least, this is why it's so important for us to kind of understand the nature of the conversation we're having, because frankly, I'm never going to convince someone who refuses to understand that the paradigm or the worldview that they're operating inside of is limited, right? Which is why I also think that we can't wait for the whole system to change before we give permission, right, for the people who want to do this, to begin doing it, and to be able to talk about the outcomes that they are getting in really important ways. And I'll just name that one of the really interesting examples to me about this, like in our the last 20 years, was the college preparatory education model, right? So the college preparatory model came out. We said, oh my God, this is the best system because look at these test scores, they're going up. It turned out you hit a population, like you hit a plateau in terms of what those schools were able to do, because over time they stopped being able to serve the students for whom perhaps that model worked quite well, and they no longer worked for kids who couldn't learn like that, or for whom reading and writing were not the kind of preferred or the best methods for showing what they know. And we began to see, right, the dribble of evidence that kind of came in, and it's like, oh God, this thing that for so long, right, how many policies did we shape around that particular approach to education? And it turns out, so any research to me, the only conclusion you can really make is it works for this group of students at this period of time in this context, right? That's it. And so, and then I guess the last thing I'll say is that, like, we have to remember the altitude, like, who is it? Who's the unit that we care about? We care about the individual student. And the kind of Cartesian Newtonian worldview tries to pull everything up to this 10,000, 20,000 foot level where somehow you can be objective, you can be removed, you can compare things across kind of different contexts. But if I actually care about the living human being that I'm working with, then we have to push our research down to the level of the unit that we care about. And that is that learner, their context, their classroom, their relationships, right? All of those. And it's going to be really hard to do the kind of gold standard conventional research if that's what we're prioritizing. So I don't know if that helps, Rebecca, and it's not an elevator pitch, but but I think that's part of the challenge is we've been trying to have these conversations in sound bites that are this big, when fundamentally we're having this huge, right, kind of conversation. The good thing is, more than even like 10 years ago, most of us operate in the right-hand side view in many parts of our lives, right? Because we live in a context that was made possible by living inside of those right-hand side values. And the question is, how can you make that visible to people so they can be consciously competent in operating inside of it?
Do we have any other questions? I know we have just 2 minutes while folks are thinking if they want to unmute or drop a question in the chat. I did want to say, so I believe that both Ilka and my contact information, if they're not on the very last slide, I am sure that you can access it from Nicole. I know Ilka dropped hers into the chat as well. Natalie, I think, and Aurora would very much appreciate if we take the poll to give some feedback for this. So I believe that Natalie is going to drop that into the chat.
And Natalie, are folks going to get a link to the deck? Because there was a question in the chat around that.
Yeah, we can certainly share that out. I don't know if as long as you guys are comfortable and you're okay with us doing that, we're happy to do so.
In my case, my only request would be that if you use any of the slides or something, just attribution. But yes, more than happy for folks to kind of take it.
Great. Then we'll make those available. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat box to our really brief 1-minute survey that we'd love you to just take a moment to fill out. That was an incredible session. I think I speak on behalf of a lot of folks. That was amazing. So thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us for an hour.